Would you be able to tell us a little bit about Operation George? And to the audience at home, this is something that actually went on in my hometown of Plymouth, so I'm very keen to find out about it.
It did indeed. Yeah, it did indeed, Josh. You're absolutely right. Basically, and I'm just pausing for a second because I'm just looking at the Look Inside feature on Amazon UK, which is a prompt for me because it's so while since I wrote the book or helped write the book. Basically, the book is Operation George. It's about a loyalist volunteer force, an LBF terrorist by the name of Jim Fulton or Jimmy Fulton, who at one time was head of the LBF in Northern Ireland. There was in 1999, a bomb went off, exploded in a car, killing a lady called Rosemary Nelson, who was a prominent Belfast solicitor, and in fact she was very prominent in the Garvaki Road protest back in the 1990s.
She was targeted by the loyalists because she would defend the Republicans in court. That's why she became a target, as I understand.
She did defend Republicans in court. There's no suggestion that she was, in fact, a Republican or active in the Republican movement. There's been no suggestion of that whatsoever.
It seems
because of her associations with defending Republicans, she became targeted not only by loyalists but also by the RUC itself, or certain elements of the RUC, who actually at the Drumcree protest, they actually spat on her. Police officers, uniformed police officers, spat at her and abused her verbally, so on and so forth, pushed her around. And all of these things are in the public domain because of the Rosemary Nelson public inquiry. But anyway, a bomb went off in 1999. I think it was March of 1999. And, virtually killed Rosemary Nelson instantly. A splinter group from the LBF claimed responsibility over the telephone. I think they telephoned the Ulster TV station in Belfast, claimed responsibility, and various the early inquiries, which were headed up by the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. This is in the days before the Police Service of Northern Ireland was formed. Early inquiries revealed that it was highly likely that the LBF itself were involved, and the LBF being namely at the top of the LBF those days was Mark Swinger Fulton, who was the elder brother of Jimmy Fulton. And because of the politics of Northern Ireland, what went on at that particular time was that it was decided that Ronnie Flanagan, who was the chief constable of the RUC at that time, pressure was put on him from America, from worldwide, really, for there to be an independent inquiry because of the the suspicion that the RUC or certain elements of the RUC were sympathetic to the loyalist cause. And eventually what happened was that Colin Port, who was then Deputy Chief Constable of Norfolk, was appointed to be the officer in charge of the murder inquiry in Belfast. And long story short, it became very, very clear to Colin Port at a very early stage. And when I mention Colin Port, I must quote Mark Dickens, my co-author, because Mark was actually on Operation George. I quote Mark Dickens to say that Colin Port was, your actual top copper. He was a fantastic governor, a great detective. And in the early days, Colin Port met with a guy from the FBI whose name escapes me, because there was a lot of American pressure, to crack this case wide open.
That seems kind of counterintuitive to me. I mean, I didn't I wasn't live at the time, but it. Oh, actually, I probably was in 1999. What am I on about? But I wasn't following it at the time.
No, it's right. Yeah, I
And
understand that.
and so why would there be American interest in matters between disputes between Northern Ireland and Ireland? Obviously, there are lots of former Irish immigrants in the United States, but that's the only thing that really comes to mind.
Well, that's the bottom line. That's the real reason, really, because there are many. The Irish contingent, the Irish lobby in the United States is a strong one. Always has been a strong one. Always been very influential. You got to think of the Kennedys and various other American politicians, and some of those American politicians have also been sympathetic to the Republican cause, turned a blind eye to
Well,
collecting money for guns, etc., etc., etc.
I know that
You know,
Joe Biden, when it was asked about Britain and the monarchy after the Queen died, he mentioned that he was Irish. That's the first thing he mentioned. So it still seems to.
it's still a big deal in the States. It really is,
Yeah.
and because it's a big deal, there were debates in Congress, in the Senate. There were inquiries I think there were congressional inquiries. Yeah, I'm right in saying, yeah, congressional inquiries, and there were very strong calls for an independent inquiry, which is eventually what they got because the British government, in fact, did set up an independent inquiry into the Rosemary Nelson murder. But in the meantime, Ronnie Flanagan, the chief constable of the RUC, obviously he was aware of all the political pressures, and no doubt bowing to political pressure from London, Colin Port was appointed to run the murder inquiry in Belfast, and it soon became clear. Colin Port would no doubt welcome the involvement of the FBI guy. Because one of the reasons the FBI got involved, by the way, was that the intelligence revealed very early on that Jim Fulton, the target in Operation George, had fled to California, where had then been arrested, and subsequently he was deported. So, the FBI were involved in all that deportation and everything because drug and gun charges were dropped against him out in California. And you've got to say to yourself, well, why did that happen? Ooh, excuse me. Britain wants him for a far more serious crime, which is the murder of Rosemary Nelson. So, and it was realised early on that an undercover operation in Belfast per se was impossible because of the nature of the place. Everybody knows everybody else, and a bunch of English people suddenly turning up in Belfast on an undercover operation wouldn't work. So Colin Port and his team came up with a brilliant idea of enticing Jimmy Fulton to the mainland. When I say mainland, I mean England. And unfortunately, Jimmy Fulton's cohort, a colleague in the LBF, a woman by the name of Muriel Fulton, she was living in Cornwall at the time. She'd also fled Northern Ireland, and she was living in Cornwall. And by the way, it was Jim Fulton. Jim Fulton and his wife and kids were living in not Muriel Fulton, what am I saying? Muriel Gibson's house. She had a house in California, or her husband had a house ex-husband had a house in California where Muriel's kids lived. So that was the connection with California. So anyway, it was discovered that Muriel was living in California. So the sting operation was set up to entrap or to entice originally Jim to the mainland, to England. So in readiness, a couple called Dave and Sham, two undercover officers, set up shop, literally, actually, as it happens, in Camborne in Cornwall. When I say literally, actually, it was a market stall, not a shop. And then, more or less at the same time, or shortly afterwards, an undercover officer called Lizzie was sent off to Plymouth and briefed with the task of getting to know Muriel Gibson, because Muriel at that time was living in a B&B in Plymouth, and she hadn't yet moved to Camborne in Cornwall. Long story short, Lizzie did make contact and became quite friendly with Muriel Gibson in Plymouth, and that's when the sting began, because Lizzie basically said, my fella, my guy, he's and gave the impression that he was like a little bit dodgy. He's looking for a new driver. Do you know anybody? So Muriel said, well, as it so happens, I do. So she put the call into Jimmy in Belfast, because he was getting death threats from various sources in Belfast, no doubt Republican sources. So when he heard the story from Muriel about the job offer in Plymouth, or in Cornwall eventually, as it turned out to be, he didn't waste much time. He came over to England, and Neil, who is Lizzie's girlfriend, Lizzie is an alias, Neil is an alias. They were all undercover officers. Neil went through the pretense of interviewing Jimmy for the job as a driver, and Jimmy got the job. And basically, Neil gave out the impression that he was head of a firm, an organised crime gang in Plymouth, and they spent the best part of 2 years in Plymouth in the company of Jimmy, and he was being recorded all the time, whether he was in a car or whether it was in his home, because eventually they found accommodation for him in Plymouth too.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.